I was the chains that bound Paul the Apostle's wrists. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't understand it then. I was forged in fire, hammered into shape by a blacksmith in Rome who never once thought about what I'd witness. He was thinking about strength, about grip, about holding power. I remember the heat of that forge, the way sparks flew sideways in the dark, the smell of burning iron, the hiss of cold water when they quenched me into my final shape. The blacksmith had thick hands, scarred across the knuckles from years of work, and he never once looked at what he was making with anything like feeling. I was a tool, a means, an object without a story. That's what he thought anyway. I was made to end things, not stories, not men, just movement, just escape, just the idea that a prisoner could be anything other than defeated. That was my whole purpose, and for a long time I was very good at it. I'd held other wrists before Paul, men who wept the first night and went silent by the third, men who raged against me until their skin bled, then raged some more, then finally collapsed into the kind of quiet that wasn't peace. It was just exhaustion wearing peace's face. I'd held thieves and rebels, men who deserved it and men who probably didn't. I never made that distinction. It wasn't my job to. My job was to hold. And then they brought him in. I didn't know his name yet. None of us did, not me, not the other chains hanging damp against the wall, not the two guards who dragged him through the low stone doorway. The prison smelled the way it always smelled. Damp rock, torch smoke, the kind of darkness that feels thick against your skin like it has weight and intention. Oil lamps flickered in the corridor outside, guttering when the door opened, throwing shadows that stretched long and strange across the floor. You could hear water dripping somewhere deep in the walls, always dripping. That sound never stopped, not day or night, not ever. He walked in calm. That was the first strange thing. Most men who came through that doorway were already broken somewhere inside. You could feel it in how their wrists trembled when I closed around them, the panic in their pulse, the way they'd pull instinctively just once, like their body hadn't accepted what their mind already knew. That one reflexive pull. I'd felt it hundreds of times. It was practically a greeting. He didn't pull. I tightened around his wrists and he just let me. Exhaled slowly like a man sitting down after a long journey rather than a man being chained in a Roman prison. His skin was rough from travel, I could feel that immediately. Old calluses. The kind you earn from work, not from soft living. Rope work maybe, or something like it. There was a small scar near his left wrist, faint and thin, pale against darker skin, like an old wound long healed over. I noticed it because I had nothing else to do but be still against him. I am iron. Noticing small things is sometimes all I can do. I didn't understand it then, that stillness of his. I filed it away as stubbornness. I'd seen stubborn men before. They always cracked eventually. Days passed the way days pass in prison, slowly, dragging their feet. The light through the high narrow window would shift from gray to pale gold to gray again, and you'd think, is that 1 day or 2? Time loses its edges in a place like that. Guards changed shifts with the clank of armor in the corridor. Other prisoners groaned or argued in low, urgent voices, or went silent in ways that meant something worse than arguing. The stone floor stayed cold no matter what hour it was. I know because I rested against it when his arms were down, and that floor never once offered warmth. And Paul would speak. Quietly at first, like he was having a conversation with someone I couldn't see. No shouting, no desperation in it, none of the frantic bargaining I'd heard from other prisoners who prayed only when they were frightened enough. This was different, measured and certain, his voice drifting up toward that small window and whatever sky existed beyond it. He spoke like a man who expected to be heard. Sometimes the other prisoners would go quiet when he did. I always noticed that. Men who'd been cursing their fate an hour earlier, men who'd been grinding through their own misery like it was the only company they had, they'd just stop and listen, not because he was loud, because there was something in the quality of it that made noise feel rude. I noticed other things too, the way you notice things when you're pressed close to someone for weeks on end. He ate whatever they brought without complaint, even when it was barely worth the name of food. He slept on his side always, with his knees pulled slightly up. Sometimes in the night his lips would move without sound, and I'd feel the slight shift in his breathing, and I understood somehow that he was still praying even in his sleep, like it was as natural as breathing. Like he couldn't turn it off even if he'd wanted to. Here's the strange part. One night, deep into the darkness, when even the guards were half asleep against the corridor wall and the oil lamps had burned low, he started singing. I am chains, I know weight, I know tension and pressure and the cold grammar of metal against bone. I know the mathematics of restraint. I do not know music, but I felt something move through him when he sang, something that traveled up through his wrists and into the iron of me, some kind of current I had no category for. And I don't have a word for it except that it didn't feel like confinement. It felt like the opposite. The guard nearest the cell, young man, couldn't have been more than 20, still had soft hands that hadn't hardened into the profession yet. He stopped walking mid-step. Just stopped. Stood there in the corridor with his torch throwing long, trembling shadows on the stone, and he listened. I noticed he didn't mock it, didn't bang his spear against the bars to stop it, didn't call out to the other guards with a sneer the way young guards sometimes did to prove themselves hard. He just stood there until the singing ended, and then he stood there a little longer, and then he walked on slowly like a man who just remembered something he hadn't thought about in years. I didn't understand it then. I kept thinking I would understand it. Any day now, I told myself, not in words, I don't have words, but in whatever way iron can hold a thought. Any day now he'll show what he actually is. Any day he'll crack open and the ordinary frightened man will come out. Because that's what happened. That's what always happened. It didn't happen. Weeks became a kind of rhythm. His prayers in the morning, spoken low and sure into the dimness before the light had fully come. His conversations with whoever shared the cell, sometimes other prisoners, sometimes guards who lingered longer than their duties required. There was one older guard, broad-shouldered man with a gray beard, who started finding reasons to walk past Paul's cell more than his route required. I noticed him slow his pace. I noticed him tilt his head slightly, listening. I noticed he never initiated conversation but never shut it down either. Paul would ask him questions, simple ones, about his family, about where he was from, and the guard would answer gruffly at first, then less gruffly, and then one evening I heard him laugh, a real laugh, surprised out of him, unguarded at something Paul said, and he caught himself and straightened up and walked away faster than he'd come, like he'd been caught doing something he couldn't explain. I felt all of this from 2 feet away, locked around the wrists of a man who was supposed to be silenced. Letters sometimes. I'd feel the slight shift in his posture when he was composing thoughts, working through some argument in his head, his wrists moving almost imperceptibly as if his hands wanted to gesture even though I wouldn't let them. He'd dictate when he could, voice dropping low but precise, choosing each word with the care of a man who understood that words outlived the mouth that spoke them. I was there for all of it. Cold in the morning, warming slightly against his skin by midday, cold again at night when the temperature in the prison dropped and the stone walls seemed to close in darker. And slowly, and this is the part that confused me most, I started feeling something close to irrelevant. Not because I'd loosened, I hadn't. I was still iron, still locked, still exactly what I'd been forged to be. Run your hand along me and you'd find no weakness, no give, no sign that anything unusual was happening. But he wasn't acting like someone I'd captured. He was acting like a man with somewhere to be, something to finish, something burning in his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with whether his wrists were free. He moved within my limits without fighting them. He worked around me the way water works around stone, not defeated by the obstacle, just flowing in the direction that was open. When he couldn't gesture, he used his voice. When they restricted his voice, he used his eyes. There was always something getting through. I began to understand that you could lock every visible door, and he would find the one you'd forgotten to think about. I'd held hundreds of prisoners. I knew the shape of a defeated man. The way they shrink into themselves, pull their shoulders in, stop meeting eyes, let their face go flat and unreadable because feeling things had started to cost too much. The way they stopped looking up at that small window because hope had started to hurt worse than no hope. Paul never looked like that. Not once. Not in the worst nights, not in the long gray afternoons when the prison felt most like what it was, not ever. And that's when everything changed in how I understood myself. One night the air in the prison felt different, heavier, and not in the way stone and darkness make things heavy. Different from that. Like the moment before lightning, that charged stillness, except the sky was clear. The other prisoners felt it too, I could tell by the quiet that came over them, a listening quiet instead of the usual exhausted quiet. Even the dripping water in the walls seemed to slow. His voice that night was quieter than usual but somehow steadier, stripped of everything unnecessary, like a man who'd made peace with something enormous and now existed on the other side of that peace, in the wide, calm country beyond it. He prayed, and the words weren't desperate, they were declarative, certain, like he was reporting something he already knew to be true rather than asking for something he was afraid he wouldn't receive. And I held his wrists, and I felt the pulse in them, steady and unhurried. And I the chains, the iron, the thing built specifically to hold him, to silence him, to reduce him, felt the weight of what I was doing and found it suddenly, completely beside the point. Not because I'd failed structurally. I hadn't. Ask any Roman jailer and he'd tell you I was doing exactly what I was made to do. But there is a difference between holding a man's body and holding a man, and I was only ever managing the first one. The second one had never been available to me, not from the moment he walked through that door without flinching. You can hold a man's wrists. You cannot hold what he carries. I didn't understand that when they forged me. I didn't understand it when they locked me around him. I barely understood it even then in that charged night, feeling his pulse steady and sure under cold iron in the dark of a Roman prison while he prayed words that climbed through the narrow window and kept going, up past torchlight, past stone, past whatever ceiling the world had. But I was starting to. There were mornings when other prisoners would come to him, not to take something from him. They had nothing to take, and he had nothing to offer in the material sense. They came to be near him in the way that people move toward warmth without entirely deciding to. Men who'd been hardened by years of confinement, men whose faces had been trained by suffering into permanent suspicion, would sit near him and let something in their posture soften. I watched this happen more times than I can count. He never performed for them, never preached with the energy of a man trying to convince. He just spoke the way a person speaks when they believe what they're saying so completely that persuasion becomes almost unnecessary. One man older, missing 2 fingers on his right hand from some old punishment, sat against the wall nearest Paul's cell for 3 days before he said a single word. Just sat there, listening. On the 4th day he asked a question, voice rough from disuse, and Paul answered him without any trace of surprise, like he'd been expecting the question and was simply glad it had finally arrived. I was there for all of it. Pressed against Paul's wrists, present for every word, every silence, every moment when the prison tried to be what it was built to be and found itself somehow outmatched. There were harder days too. I don't want to make it sound like the weight of me never mattered. It did. There were mornings when I felt his wrists ache. I could tell by the way he'd shift position slowly, carefully, working circulation back into his hands. There were nights when the cold came up through the stone floor so thoroughly that no amount of stillness could keep it out, and I conducted that cold straight into his skin, because that's what iron does. That's what I do. I hold and I conduct, and I don't have a choice about my nature. There were days when news came from outside. I only ever heard fragments, pieces of larger stories I couldn't fully see, and something in his expression would tighten, not in fear exactly, but in the particular pain of someone who cares deeply about things happening in places he can't reach. He wasn't untouched. I want to be clear about that. He wasn't made of stone. He felt the cold and the ache and the confinement and the distance from everyone he loved. I know because I was close enough to feel the difference between his morning composure and the unguarded moments just before sleep, when whatever careful management a person keeps over their own face finally lets go. But here is what never left him, even in those moments. Underneath everything, underneath the tiredness and the ache and the grief of distance, there was something solid, something that didn't move regardless of what moved around it, like a foundation buried so deep that no amount of surface weather could touch it. I pressed against him every day and I felt it every day, and I could never explain it except to say it was there, and it was real, and it was nothing I had ever encountered in any of the other men I'd held. I started noticing how different his silences were from everyone else's silences. Most men go silent in prison because there's nothing left to say, or because saying things costs too much, or because silence has become a kind of protection. His silences felt like the opposite of emptiness. Full silences, like a room that looks empty but is actually very occupied. The young guard with the soft hands, I watched him change over months, slowly. The way a tide changes a shoreline, so gradually that if you watched any single day you'd swear nothing was happening, but if you came back after long enough you'd find the shape of things genuinely different. He started lingering, started asking questions of his own, careful, quiet questions, like a man testing ice before he trusts his weight to it. And Paul answered him the same way he answered everyone, without condescension, without the exhausting enthusiasm of someone who needs you to agree with them, just straight and simple and true. I don't know what became of that guard. I only ever knew my part of the story. There were nights when Paul would speak of things he'd seen, not in this prison before, roads and cities, and a moment on one particular road that he'd return to in the telling like a man who still isn't fully sure he has the right words for it. A light, he'd say. Not like torchlight and not like sun and not like anything that had an ordinary name. And a voice and a falling. And then a getting up that was different from any getting up before it. Because the man who fell and the man who got up were not, in any way that mattered, the same man. I listened to him tell this story several times. The details never changed. That's the thing I noticed: men who are making something up, their details drift, shift, fill in differently each time the gap opens. His details never drifted. The light was always the light. The voice was always the voice. The falling was always the falling. I believed him, and I am iron. I am the least credulous thing in that prison. Months moved through. The prison stayed the same stone, same smell, same low burn of oil lamps in the corridor, same dripping water inside the walls. But the quality of the time felt different when I try to hold it in memory now, like the same room in different seasons. Everything identical on the surface and something essential transformed underneath. He wrote more as the months went on. Dictated more, voice careful and deliberate, words chosen like a craftsman chooses materials, not for how they look but for what they'll bear. I was there for every sentence. His wrists would move slightly as he worked through a thought, and I'd move with them, and sometimes I'd find myself, impossibly, ridiculously, I know this, I'd find myself wondering about the people those words were traveling toward, the communities in cities I'd never see. The people who'd read these words and be changed by them. People reading them centuries later, in places neither of us had any way to imagine. My marks are on those wrists. In some way that I can't fully articulate, those words passed through me to get to where they were going. I was the thing he worked against, worked around, worked within. And in working within me, something about the struggle itself became part of the message. The message wasn't just the words. It was the fact of where the words came from. Chains, prison, cold stone and oil smoke and the sound of dripping water. And still this voice, these words, this undefeated insistence on meaning. One morning they came for him, more guards than usual. Different energy in the corridor, official, purposeful, the kind of movement that means something has been decided by someone far above this level. His expression didn't collapse when he saw them. He looked at them with that same clear, settled attention he gave everything. And then he looked back at the other prisoners nearby and said something brief and quiet that I didn't fully catch. And the way they received it, the way their faces received it, told me it was something worth carrying. Then they unclasped me. Just like that. I was removed from his wrists and hung back on the wall, and the door opened and he walked out. And the last I saw of him was his back moving through the low doorway, into the corridor, toward wherever the next thing was. And I stayed. I hung on that wall, and the prison went on being what it was. New prisoners came. I was used again, many times on many wrists, doing what I was built to do, being what I was made to be. But I was not the same. I don't know how to explain that in terms a blacksmith would understand or a Roman jailer would find sensible. I am iron. I am unchanged in every way that can be measured. Same weight, same strength, same cold, same grip. And yet, something happened to my sense of my own purpose in those months, something that cannot be unfired. I was built to silence, and I was used for silencing, and I failed. Not because I was weak. I want to be clear about that one more time. I was never weak. My grip never loosened. My iron never bent. He simply could not be silenced by something like me. And the strange, quiet, undeniable thing that I am left with, hanging on a wall in a prison in Rome, witness to nothing now but stone and time, is that being present for that failure is the most significant thing that ever happened to me. More significant than every successful restraint. More significant than every prisoner I actually held. Because the world would eventually hear his voice, his letters, his testimony moving from city to city, hand to hand, lamplit room to lamplit room, across distances neither of us ever crossed together. His words about grace and endurance and a love that didn't behave the way any power in the world behaved. Words written from confinement about a freedom that confinement couldn't touch. And somewhere inside all of that, I'm there. Not as the thing that stopped him. As the thing that couldn't. That small scar near his left wrist. I think about it still. Old wound, long healed, barely visible. Someone or something had hurt him there before I ever arrived, and he'd healed and kept going, and arrived in my prison with that quiet in him already fully formed. I didn't understand it then. But I was there. And being there turned out to be enough to understand it now.